7. Sacrilege and Judgment. According to the law, the firstfruits belong to God, whether of the fruits of the field, in the production of liquors or anything else, or of the sons born to a woman. Exodus chapter 22, verses 29 and 30. Like the tithe, the firstfruits belong to God, and to deny them to him is sacrilege. As a result, when Israel entered Canaan, not only was there a tithe of conquered things, but the first conquered city belonged entirely to God. Jericho was thus set apart in advance as a dedicated city. All its silver and gold and all its vessels of brass and iron had to go into the treasury of the Lord. Joshua chapter 6, verse 29. However, because of the iniquity of Canaan, God's judgment in full had to fall upon Jericho. They had to destroy utterly all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, and ox and sheep and ass with the edge of the sword, and to burn everything else totally. Joshua chapter 6, verses 21 and 24. Only Rahab and her household were spared, and they too were spared as a part of God's possession. The prince of the host of the Lord had appeared to Joshua, indicating that Jericho's capture was God's battle, and everything therein, whether kept alive or destroyed, belonged to God alone. Joshua chapter 5, verses 13 to 15. After the destruction of Jericho, Rahab and her household were kept for a time without or outside the camp of Israel. Joshua chapter 6, verse 23. Until they could meet the ritual purification required of members of the covenant, that is, circumcision, sacrifice, etc. However, by virtue of their rescue and separation as God's firstfruits, Rahab and her household had an imputed holiness and were, like the gold and silver, and the vessels, sacred and set apart for the Lord. Rahab thus entered Israel with a double status as an ex-prostitute, and also as one with a particular sacredness as God's first fruit of Canaan. Sacrilege, however, was committed in the conquest of Jericho. But the children of Israel committed a trespass in the accursed thing, for Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zabdi, the son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took of the accursed thing. The anger of the Lord was kindled against the children of Israel. Joshua chapter 7, verse 1. As a result of this sacrilege committed by one man while representing the nation itself felt the impact of God's judgment. As they sought to capture Ai, not an important city, they found themselves unexpectedly defeated. Joshua, like Israel, was ready to blame God for deserting them. Joshua chapter 7, verses 6 to 9. This was an assertion of causality. God, as ultimate cause, was responsible for Israel's defeat. The Lord, in his rejection of Joshua's prayer, asserted causality also, while not denying his ultimate causality, but rather affirming it. He emphatically set forth the proximate or immediate cause as responsible. Israel had sinned and had committed sacrilege in the Battle of Jericho, Joshua chapter 7, verses 10 to 15. It was sin to look only at God's ultimate causation. The reality of proximate causes, of human causes, cannot be denied or set aside. God's causality is operative because there is justice. Thus, where God's judgment appears, man must look first to the human factor in order to determine why God has brought judgment to bear on a nation. The theft by Achan involved considerable wealth. A goodly Babylonianish garment and 200 shekels of silver, and a wedge of gold of 50 shekels weight. Joshua chapter 7, verse 21. The whole family of Achan was involved in his guilt, in that the loot had been buried in the middle of the tent, obviously with the cooperation of all. Joshua chapter 7, verses 21 to 24. They thus shared in Achan's guilt and judgment. But this is not all. While settlements sprang up near the site of the original Jericho and used the same name, the original Jericho had to remain set apart to God, its ruined ground a witness to God's requirements. We are told, "And Joshua adjured them at that time, saying, Cursed be the man before the Lord that riseth up and buildeth this city Jericho. He shall lay the foundation thereof in his firstborn, and in his youngest son shall he set up the gates of it." Joshua chapter 6, verse 26. A good many centuries later, in Ahab's day, Jericho was rebuilt. In his days did Hiel the Bethelite build Jericho. He laid the foundation thereof in Abiram his firstborn, and set up the gates thereof in his youngest son Segub, according to the word of the Lord, which he spake by Joshua the son of Nun. 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 34. The territory around Jericho belonged to the tribe of Benjamin, and thus properly belonged to the southern kingdom, to Judah. The construction was under the auspices of Ahab, indicating that some of Judah's realm was under Ahab's rule, and perhaps all of it somewhat dependent on him. In Joshua's day, the fortress city of Jericho was the eastern guardian of the land of Canaan. With the east bank of the Jordan in Israelite hands, there was now no need of such a fortress in the midst of the realm. The reconstruction of Jericho, militarily, meant a line of division in the land. However, other such fortresses had been built, and both Israel and Judah were at times in open conflict. The religious significance of Jericho was the key issue. The ruined site of Jericho was a continuing witness to God's saving power and God's claim on all the firstfruits of Israel. To rebuild Jericho meant not only to deny God's present claims on Israel, but to reach back into past ages and to deny God's firstfruits as Joshua had rendered them. As Barr commented with respect to Ahab, "As he denied the God of Israel and placed the Baal of the Canaanites in his stead, so he also denied the great saving act of Jehovah as manifested in the fall and destruction of Jericho." Is the judgment on sacrilege meted out with regard to Jericho simply holy history, with no relationship to our everyday history? Is it a supernatural act of biblical history, unrelated to the natural events of our history? The Bible asserts natural and historical consequences for sacrilege as well as for obedience. When Phinehas killed Zimri and Cosby for his faithfulness, he was promised a long continuance of his posterity in the priesthood. When Saul committed 4 sacrilegious acts, he and his family were cut off from their power, even as the sons of Eli had earlier been cut off for their 2 sacrilegious acts, that is, misappropriation of what belonged to God and fornication within the precincts of the tabernacle. Material acts thus have material consequences. If I put my hand into the fire, I have a burnt hand, not a burned mind. It is a deformation of reality to transfer the effects from one area to another. Jericho was God's first fruits in Canaan. When Hiel rebuilt Jericho, he lost his firstborn son, and, as the penalty for his offense, his youngest son as well. Webb and Neal, in applying this fact to history, set forth this thesis. Property, consecrated to God in the service of his church, has generally, when alienated to secular purposes, brought misfortune on its possessors, whether by strange accidents, by violent deaths, by loss of wealth, or, and that chiefly, by failure of heirs male, and such property hardly ever continues long in one family. Let us survey history briefly in terms of this. When the medieval church used the tithes, offerings, first fruits, and bequests given to Christ prodigally and falsely, it met judgment at the hands of both the various monarchs, first of all, and then the reformers. Unfortunately, too often both the monarchs, Catholic and Protestant, and on occasion churchmen, added sacrilege to sacrilege. The seizure of church properties by Henry VIII was plainly sacrilege. Granted that there had been some corruption, although probably far less than Henry VIII claimed. The church buildings, lands, and foundations belonged to Christ, not to Henry. Theft is not reformation, it is sacrilege. Thomas Lever, in a sermon of February 2nd, 1550, in the days of young Edward VI, declared plainly, "Seeing that impropriations, being so evil that no man can allow them, be now so employed unto the universities, yea, unto the yearly revenues of the King's Majesty, that few dare speak against them, you may see that some men, not only by the abuse of riches and authority, but also by the abuse of wisdom and policy, do much harm, and specially those by whose means this realm is now brought into such case that either learning in the university and necessary revenues belong to the most high authority is like to decay, or else impropriations to be maintained, which both be devilish and abominable, that if either of them come to effect, it will cause the vengeance of God utterly to destroy this realm." Lever said plainly that the old abuses of Rome needed correcting. He was ready to agree more than moral grounds permitted that something of the church wealth might have accrued to the throne at the time of the suppression of the chantries to take care of expenses, but the commitment of that wealth was to God's cause and to charitable causes in Christ's name, and anything short of that was a betrayal of the Reformation. I tell you, at the first, the intent was very godly, the pretence wondrous goodly, but now the use, or rather the abuse and misorder of these things is worldly, is wicked, is devilish, is abominable. But you which have gotten these goods into your own hands, to turn them from evil to worse, and other goods more from good unto evil, be ye sure it is even you that have offended God, beguiled the king, robbed the rich, spoiled the poor, and brought a commonwealth into common misery. It is even you that must either be plagued with God's vengeance, as were the Sodomites, or amend by repentance, as did the Ninevites. Even you it is that must either make restitution and amends speedily, or else feel the vengeance of God grievously. Lever's analysis was an honest one. Church wealth had been turned from evil to worse, in some cases and in others, from good unto evil. The solution was provided by God's law: restitution. Without that solution, the nation was degenerating from bad to worse. According to W.K. Jordan, while Lever's plea did not change the course of the state's policy, it had much to contribute towards the rise of the secular charitable impulse which marks the Edwardian era. The great wave of Puritan charity and tithing did much to alter England, but the old crime was not atoned for. However, many, like Lever, felt that, in some sense, restitution was being made. It was in 1536 that Henry VIII began the dissolution of the monasteries. In 1667, South, in preaching on sacrilege, declared, "We need not go many nations off, nor many ages back, to see the vengeance of God upon some families, raised upon the ruins of churches, and enriched with the spoils of sacrilege, gilded with the name of Reformation. And, for the most part, so unhappy have been the purchasers of church lands that the world is not now to seek for an argument, from a long experience, to convince it that, though in such purposes men have usually the cheapest pennyworths, yet they have not always the best bargains. For the holy thing has stuck fast to their sides like a fatal shaft, and the stone has cried out of the consecrated walls they have lived within, for a judgment upon the head of the sacrilegious intruder, and heaven has heard the cry, and made good the curse. So that, when the heir of a blasted family has risen up and promised fair, and perhaps flourished for some time upon the stock of excellent parts and great favour, yet at length a cross event has certainly met and stopped him in the career of his fortunes, so that he has ever after withered and declined, and in the end come to nothing, or to that which is worse. So certainly does that which some call blind superstition take aim when it shoots a curse at the sacrilegious person. But I shall not engage in the odious task of recounting the families which this sin is blasted with a curse. South assumed that the fact of judgment on sacrilege was so obvious in English history between 1536 and 1667 that there was no need to make a case. He only reminded his hearers of a fact apparently obvious to all. To have bought or to own church lands was to be blasted by God's vengeance. Was this popular assumption true? In 1632, Sir Henry Spelman documented this fact of judgment, and after his death, his study of sacrilege was published in 1698. He found only 14 continuing families out of 630 families who had gained church lands, and clear evidence of judgment of 600 families. Webb and Neale carried the study further, and pointed out also that one could not eliminate the data by saying that the extinction of families was common in those days. There was a clear-cut difference between the families guilty of sacrilege and those that were not. According to Webb and Neale, statistically, the failure of male heirs in families implicated in sacrilege is much more frequent than in those which are not so implicated, and further, that church lands change their possessors far more frequently than those which have never been devoted to God. Heal, for his sacrilege, lost both his firstborn and youngest sons. Many Englishmen have lost all their male heirs for their greater sacrilege. Moreover, Webb and Neale cited evidences of a continuing and lingering curse with respect to the abbey lands. Now, by purchase, by bequest, by exchange, by marriage, the contamination has been communicated and recommunicated till it is difficult to say who is absolutely clear. And the case is still more complicated with respect to lands. In one part of England, Henry VIII divided some of the church spoils among 260 gentlemen. At the same time, Thomas, Duke of Norfolk, established 20 of his gentlemen out of his own inheritance. Not 60 of the king's 260 Donneys had a son to inherit, whereas all 20 of the duke's men had heirs. Webb and Neale give much more precise data substantiating this fact. Where men have robbed God of his firstfruits, God has taken their firstfruits and more from them. They concluded, "We can only lament these things. We cannot correct them. We have no reason to think God will be reconciled to national sin without national restitution, and there is less chance of that every day. As long as a land has a saving remnant whose works invoke God's blessings, the curse is to that extent limited. Today, however, the saving remnant is everywhere small. Since then, sacrilege has proliferated, not only with the French and Russian revolutions, but with the growing statism in all nations, whereby the state claims the first fruits. The curse for rebuilding Jericho was effective 520 years after it was pronounced. There is no reason to believe that God, since then, has had lapses of memory where sacrilege is concerned. Tithes, offerings, lands, and other properties belonging to God cannot be alienated from him. There are no lapses of memory with God, and the demand for restitution therefore remains. What belongs to God cannot be alienated from God. It is his by right, and he requires it. What has been taken from God must be restored to God, because every gift given to God is inalienably his, or the full value thereof. It is not morally possible to hold that, because we are under grace, we can disregard the laws of sacrilege, restitution, and restoration. We have been redeemed by God's sovereign grace, not that we should now aggravate or continue in the sins of unbelief and rebellion, but that the righteousness of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk, not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. Romans chapter 8, verse 4. To disobey God is to invite the curse, and the curse on sacrilege is especially severe. A time of judgment is also a time of redemption, in that it delivers the covenant keepers from the ungodly and enhances their blessing. The impropriations in England may seem now to be a dead issue. They are in fact a very live one in a number of ways. For one thing, impropriations constituted a legalized seizure of property and a precedent for further seizures. Since then, legalized confiscation or theft of property has had a strong precedent, and the properties of the nobility, the middle classes, the lower classes, and of the crown itself have not been immune to the control and or confiscation of Parliament. A significant fact, too, is that sacrilege, once feared by believer and unbeliever alike, is no longer regarded seriously by either. One of the central products of humanistic science has been an undercutting of the idea of causality as too theological a concept. As a result, to consider divine causality is impossible for modern man. He has a mental block against the very possibility of such a concept. However, what man believes or disbelieves does not alter reality. The unrecognized divine causality shall prevail, not humanistic man.